The strangers on the horizon. The sun had barely cleared the rim of the distant hills when Clara Whitford stepped out into the crisp morning air. The prairie stretched before her, a sweep of muted golds and browns under a pale sky. The wind carried the faint scent of sage, but beneath it lingered the sharper odor of dry dust, reminders of the long summer that had not been kind to her cattle or her heart. 2 years had passed since Henry's accident. 2 years since the ranch had gone quiet except for the lowing of stock and the whisper of wind through fence wire. Clara worked the land as he once had, rising before dawn, feeding stock, mending tack. But there were evenings when the silence pressed on her like a weight, making every creak of the floorboards sound louder than it should. She reached the corral gate, unlatched it, and stepped inside to check the water trough. That was when she noticed movement along the far fence line, a slow, uneven progress that did not belong to her livestock. Clara narrowed her eyes. 4 figures, small against the horizon. 3 clustered close together, the 4th taller, shoulders squared despite a noticeable weariness in his stride. They moved with the hesitant determination of those who had walked a long way without knowing if there was anywhere to stop. The cattle shifted restlessly as the group approached. Clara stepped forward, boots crunching on gravel. When they drew near, she saw the children first, thin, dark-haired, their clothes worn near to rags. Behind them came the man. His coat hung open over a shirt gone threadbare, his dark braid brushing his back. A bow slung over one shoulder marked him as a man who hunted when there was game to be found. He halted several paces away, his gaze meeting hers steadily. "We've been walking since yesterday," he said, his voice low, careful. "The children, they have not eaten." Clara's instinct wrestled with the warnings every rancher in these parts had heard. Comanche families were not welcome in town, and those who sheltered them invited trouble. But the triplets' hollow eyes held no threat, only need. "Come on in," she said, her voice more certain than she felt. "I've got stew on the stove." The man hesitated, as if gauging whether her offer was genuine. At last, he gave a single nod. The children followed her into the yard, their steps slow from exhaustion. Inside the kitchen, she ladled generous portions into bowls and set them on the table. The children fell to eating with quiet desperation. The man took the last bowl but ate little, passing more than half of it to the smallest child when he thought Clara wasn't looking. She leaned against the counter, watching them without comment. "I'm Clara Whitford," she said finally. "Daniel Blackfox," he replied. "These are Elan, Tala, and Micah." The children looked up at the sound of their names, then returned to their meal. Daniel's gaze roamed the room, as though committing every detail to memory, but he did not touch the bread she'd set beside his bowl. When the meal was done, Clara gestured toward the back door. "You can stay in the loft above the barn for now. There's hay for bedding. It's dry." Daniel's brow furrowed. "We won't trouble you long." "It's no trouble," she said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. A single woman housing a Comanche man and his children was bound to set tongues wagging. The sound of hoofbeats on the hard-packed road reached them before the knock at the door. Sheriff Calvin Reeves stood there, hat in hand, his eyes scanning past her toward the table where Daniel now stood. "Morning, Clara," he said. "I heard you might have company." She folded her arms. "Found them out by the north fence. They needed a meal." Calvin's jaw tightened. "You know folks around here won't take kindly. I can take care of my own affairs," she cut in, her voice cool. The sheriff tipped his hat, but his parting glance at Daniel carried a warning. When his horse's hoofbits faded, the kitchen felt smaller somehow, the air thicker. That evening, Clara watched from her porch as Daniel led the children toward the barn. The triplets trailed behind him like shadows, their small hands clutching the edges of his coat. The wind picked up, tugging at his braid, and he turned slightly, scanning the pasture as if searching for threats. There was something in the way he moved, steady, purposeful, that stirred a part of her she had not felt in a long time. She told herself it was only respect for a man protecting his own. But as the barn door swung shut behind them, the hollow quiet of the ranch seemed to deepen, and Clara found herself wishing she had said more. Whispers in the wind. Morning came cool and bright, the kind of early autumn day when the prairie seemed to stretch farther than it had any right to. Clara rose before the sun, as always, and found the barn already awake. The rhythmic thud of a hammer guided her steps. Daniel stood by the corral fence, sleeves rolled, driving nails into a loose board. The triplets were nearby, scattering grain for the chickens with delighted seriousness. Clara paused in the doorway, watching how easily he moved, how naturally he folded himself into the rhythms of ranch work as though he had been here all his life. "You didn't have to start on that so early," she said, stepping into the yard. Daniel straightened, resting the hammer against the fence post. It was loose. "Didn't want your cattle wandering." She wanted to tell him it wasn't his responsibility, but the words wouldn't come. There was something disarming about the quiet competence with which he did things, no expectation of thanks, no boasting, only work. Breakfast was simple: cornbread, eggs, coffee, and the triplets devoured it with the same hunger as the night before, though their eyes were brighter now. Clara caught Elan glancing toward her with shy gratitude before looking away. A faint warmth settled in her chest. As the day stretched on, Daniel mended tack in the barn while Clara saw to the cattle. Several times, she found herself glancing toward the open loft door where the children's laughter drifted down. The sound was lighter than the evening before, as though the walls and roof had already begun to shelter them in more ways than one. Near midday, a shadow crossed the yard. Martha Griggs came striding up the path, her skirts brushing dust from the grass. "Clara Whitford," she called, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who expects to be answered. Clara stepped out from the barn. "Morning, Martha." Martha's eyes flicked past her to where Daniel worked, shirt clinging to his shoulders from the heat. "Well," she said, drawing the word out, "seems you've got help." "Just giving a family a place to rest for a bit," Clara replied. "I see." Martha shifted her basket from one arm to the other, the motion deliberate. "People talk, Clara. You know they do." "I know." Clara's tone left no room for further comment, but Martha lingered anyway before turning back toward town. When she was gone, Daniel looked over. "She doesn't approve." "Most folks don't approve of much," Clara said, trying to keep it light. That evening, clouds gathered in the west, heavy and dark. The first raindrops fell as they brought the cattle in, quickening to a downpour that turned the yard to slick mud. Daniel was there each time her boot threatened to slide, a steadying hand at her elbow, nothing more, but his touch lingered in her mind even after they were inside. By the time the storm eased, the triplets were bundled in the loft with extra blankets. Clara sat by the kitchen stove, toweling her hair. Daniel stood near the doorway, silent. The lamplight caught the droplets still clinging to his braid, tracing down to his collar. "You saved a calf out there," she said quietly. "Henry would've appreciated that." He looked at her then, not long, not boldly, just enough that she felt the weight of it. "I do what needs doing." The words were simple, but they hung between them, charged with something neither dared name. Later, when the house was dark, Clara found herself lying awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. She told herself she was thinking about the coming winter, about supplies and repairs, but her mind kept drifting to the barn, to the quiet figure who had taken up space in her days without asking for it. In the morning, the storm would have passed. There would be fences to check, cattle to tend, and perhaps more whispers from town to ignore. But tonight, in the hush between gusts of wind, Clara let herself imagine the warmth of another presence beside her and tried, unsuccessfully, to forget it. Crossing the line. The first frost came early that year, silvering the grass before dawn. Clara rose with the cold, pulling her coat tight as she stepped into the yard. From the barn came the muffled thump of boots on the loft ladder. Daniel, carrying down a sack of feed. "You're up early," she called. "Couldn't sleep," he answered, setting the sack by the trough. The wind kept shifting. "Makes the cattle restless." Clara nodded, though she knew the truth wasn't just about the cattle. These last weeks had wrapped them in a quiet rhythm: shared work, shared meals, small exchanges that meant more than either would admit. But rhythms had a way of breaking when others tried to interfere. Sheriff Calvin Reeves arrived before breakfast, reins jingling as he dismounted. His greeting to Clara was curt, his eyes went straight to Daniel. "Just checking in," Calvin said, though his tone made the words sound more like a warning. "You planning to stay through winter?" Daniel stood still, neither defensive nor yielding. "We'll move on once I find steady work." Calvin's gaze slid to Clara. That'd be best. For everyone. The sheriff rode off, leaving behind the sound of his horse's hooves and the faint sting of his implication. Clara stood in the doorway a moment longer, the cold biting at her cheeks. Later, in the barn, she found Daniel repairing a bridle. The smell of oiled leather mixed with the faint warmth of hay. She stepped inside, letting the door swing shut against the wind. "You don't have to leave just because Calvin says so," she told him. Daniel kept his eyes on the bridle. "I know how towns work. Whispers turn into trouble. I've been dealing with whispers since the day I buried Henry," Clara said. "They don't scare me." Something in her voice made him pause. He set the bridle aside, his hands slow, deliberate. "And what does scare you?" She opened her mouth, but the answer tangled in her throat. It wasn't fear of gossip, it was fear of what might happen if she stopped pretending she didn't notice the way he looked at her sometimes. A sudden gust rattled the barn siding. Dust swirled through a shaft of light from the loft, catching in the air between them. Clara moved to help with the tack, but when he passed her a strap, his fingers brushed hers lightly, briefly, yet enough to still her breath. For a moment neither moved. His hand lingered, not gripping, not forcing, just there, a silent question. Clara's chest tightened with the urge to pull away, but she didn't. The bridle slipped from her other hand, landing softly in the straw. She told herself to step back, to remember that this man was only here because she had offered him kindness, because his children needed shelter. Instead, she found herself closer than before, the space between them narrowing until the scent of leather and rain-washed earth filled her lungs. Daniel's gaze dropped not to her face, but lower, to the way her breath caught in her chest. His voice was rough when he spoke. "We shouldn't." "I know," she whispered. And then he kissed her, brief, unsteady, but with a heat that burned through the chill of the barn. She didn't pull away until the sound of movement above reminded her the children were in the loft. They stepped apart, breathing hard, the air heavy with what had just happened. Daniel picked up the bridle, his hands steadying faster than hers. For the rest of the day, they spoke little. The work went on as always, fences to check, firewood to stack, but every glance between them carried the memory of that moment. Clara felt the weight of it pressing against her with every passing hour, not just the desire but the knowledge that they had crossed into a place from which there was no turning back. That night, long after the lamps were out, Clara lay awake, listening to the wind scrape branches against the roof. Somewhere in the dark, Daniel was awake too, she could feel it, as surely as she felt the pull of his presence even with the barn between them. When sleep finally came, it was uneasy, filled with the echo of his touch and the unspoken truth that whatever came next, nothing would be the same. What can't be unsaid? By the time November settled over the plains, the mornings were edged with frost and the cattle's breath steamed in the cold. Clara worked the ranch with her collar turned up against the wind, aware that each passing day drew them closer to winter and closer to the moment Daniel would have to decide where he and the children belonged. Word from town reached her before she saw the messenger. Martha Griggs arrived just after midday, cheeks red from the cold, voice sharp with the satisfaction of bringing news no one wanted. "They're saying you've taken him in for more than just chores," Martha announced, setting her hands on her hips. "If you care about your reputation." Clara cut her off. "I care about keeping 3 children from starving. That's all anyone needs to know." Martha's mouth tightened, but she didn't argue. She left soon after, her skirts snapping in the wind. Still, the words lingered, not because Clara believed them, but because she feared how they might weigh on Daniel. That evening, Daniel came in from the barn later than usual. The triplets had already gone to the loft, their soft voices drifting down like the hum of a distant river. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, then stepped inside. "We'll be leaving tomorrow," he said quietly. Clara set down the mug she was drying. "Is that what you want?" "It's what's safest," he replied. "For them. For you." The words struck harder than she expected. "You think leaving will stop the talk? The sheriff will still look at me the same. The town will still whisper." Daniel shook his head. "It isn't about them. If I stay, I don't know if I can keep from crossing the line again." The silence between them deepened. Clara's hands ached to reach for him, to pull him toward the truth she couldn't speak, that the line had already been crossed, and that she didn't regret it. After the children were asleep, Clara stepped out into the yard. The night was cold enough to bite through her coat. She found him in the barn, stacking the last of the firewood for her before they left. "You could stay," she said softly, the words clouding in the air between them. Daniel's hands stilled on the log he was holding. "You know it isn't that simple." She took a step closer. "Nothing about the last few weeks has been simple." He turned then, not fully, just enough for her to see the struggle in the way his shoulders rose and fell. She reached for his hand, not to pull, not to hold, just to touch, to anchor herself in the warmth of him before it was gone. His fingers curled around hers, slow, deliberate. They stood that way for a long moment, the barn around them filled with the smell of hay and cedar, the wind whispering through the gaps in the siding. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "If I stay, I'll take more than I have a right to. And if you go," she whispered back, "you'll leave more than you know." No kiss followed. No embrace. Only the quiet press of foreheads, the shared breath of two people who understood exactly what they were losing. At dawn, Clara stood on the porch as Daniel led the triplets down the frost-white trail. The children waved, their small hands bright against the pale morning. Daniel didn't look back, but the slow, steady set of his stride told her everything. He was leaving because staying would have been too much, and not enough. When they were gone, Clara returned to her chores. The ranch was as it had been before they arrived, silent but for the wind and the low murmur of cattle. Yet something had shifted. The emptiness felt different now, not the hollow of loss, but the ache of something she'd tasted and could never have. She carried on, as ranchers must, knowing that the memory would remain like a seed under snow, waiting, quietly alive, for a season that might never come.